In this New World weapon video, we're going to be taking a look at the bow. This is a ranged weapon that uses arrows to attack enemies, and it attacks them from mid-range. It's also only a dexterity scaling weapon, meaning if you want to increase the damage of this weapon via attributes, the only way to do it is via dexterity. Just like the musket, this weapon requires ammunition in order to use, except it uses arrows instead of cartridges, and you can either craft these or buy them or trade them with other players. Arrows are much easier to come by than ammunition or cartridges early on in the game, in my opinion. They're easier to craft. You don't need saltpeter. Depending on where you are, saltpeter can be rather difficult to get, but arrows are relatively easy to make, so this is something that if you want to try out, it's not really hard to get a bunch of arrows early on. Another really interesting thing about the bow is that you can fire it by drawing fully or not drawing fully. So when you aim the bow, you're firing a regular shot unless you hold down the left click of the mouse until it sort of starts glowing and then lets go. At that point, you're going to do more damage. Otherwise, you're doing a regular shot. And the same goes for if you're not aiming down, you're going to do a regular shot, and there's no way to charge this like when you're hip firing. So if you want to do any sort of charged shot with the bow, like a full draw, you need to do that while aiming, and you need to hold down the left mouse button once your bow is fully drawn. A couple other things about the bow. First of all, it has a bit of an arc to it. So if you start shooting over a longer distance, you're going to need to compensate for the arc. This is something the musket doesn't really need to do, which makes the bow a bit harder to use at very long ranges. And I would recommend that you switch to a musket if you like really long range gameplay. But if you like mid-range or close mid-range, the bow is a lot better of an option because you can use it in melee more effectively as well, because there are abilities that work very, very closely. In fact, you don't want to be too far with the bow because it's kind of hard to hit your target. The other thing is that your arrows can start bleeding on the target. I think there's just a chance to cause bleeding depending on where you hit them. I don't know if it's a crit or whatever it is exactly. But sometimes your arrows will set bleeding, which is not something that musket shots do. So sometimes you'll get a bleed on your target, which is very beneficial to taking it down. Okay, moving along to the skill trees of bows, you have Skirmisher and Hunter. The Skirmisher tree deals more with AoE damage and close range encounters like sort of pseudo melee, allowing you to deal damage to enemies very, very closely, or to deal damage to like groups of enemies that you may find if you're fighting up close, since enemies trying to charge you. When you aggro them, if you aggro several, then they're going to be fighting very, very close range. The Hunter ability tree is more about dealing damage at range and dealing single target damage. They have some abilities here that are very, very high damage, but they're basically only one target. So if you're trying to pick off one tough to kill enemy or just get one enemy or player down real fast, then the Hunter tree is your go-to for that. Okay, looking at the first ability in the Skirmisher tree is Poison Shot. This ability sets a poison cloud that basically does poison damage over time. It does weapon damage over time in a big AoE. Not a huge AoE, but a good sized one. And it doesn't matter whether you hit the target or hit it ground, wherever it lands, it's going to cause an AoE. Very good for taking out groups of enemies or setting a debuff on a group of enemies that sort of slowly whittles their health away. Maybe in dungeons or something like this, or in mid-sized PvP battles where you're like 3 or 4 players are grouped up. You can fire an arrow in there and start taking damage off all of them. Evade Shot is essentially a very point-blank ability that allows you to jump backward while you shoot a target in front of you. It's really good at creating separation between you and maybe an enemy that's aggressively pursuing you or a player. So if you like using a bow and you're going to try and use it no matter what, this is a really good ability to kind of get you out of melee range back to a safer distance where you can keep ranging the target away and rolling backward or something like that in order to keep damaging the target while you keep distance. Rain of Arrows is sort of an AoE ability. You've probably seen this in most games. It allows you to ground target an area for AoE, dealing increased damage. And when you upgrade it, these will also set a bleed. So this is a very, very good one for PvE, particularly dungeons or questing, where you're pulling multiple enemies and you want to damage them all in one go. The capstone of this tree, Knee Shot, slows the target by 10% if you hit him in the leg. This isn't that good. It's not very good in PvE. You don't really need to slow things in PvE. And it's hard to hit someone's leg well in PvP, and 10% is not that much. So I wouldn't suggest taking this capstone. Moving along to the Hunter tree, the first ability here is called Rapid Shot, and it fires 3 arrows in a row, the first 2 at 100% weapon damage, and this third one at 125%. Meaning you're getting full damage on these shots. It just does, it's 3 shots like bang, bang, bang. So if you really need to deal some damage to a target, whether it's in PvP, or maybe you're fighting a boss in PvE, or a hard to kill enemy, or maybe you just want to get rid of an enemy instantly, it's a really good ability to use. And it only uses 1 arrow for 3 arrows, so it's very ammo friendly in terms of if you want to spare ammo, just use this ability to try and kill things in 1 skill. You'll save ammo. Penetrating Shot is really, really good. It's a very high damage ability that penetrates the target. Generally, this doesn't matter that much, unless you're lined up perfectly in like a dungeon or something and you manage to pierce through a whole bunch of enemies, which can happen. It's great. But generally, you're fighting like 1 or 2 enemies, or maybe you're fighting a few players. Piercing through them doesn't happen all that often, but the high damage from it, the fact that you can keep increasing the damage as you upgrade it, makes it a really, really strong ability and good for dealing with like high burst damage. Splinter Shot is a weird one because it sort of shoots an arrow out that splits into 3 arrows and then they go their different ways. In my testing with this ability, I almost never landed a shot with it. It was so freaking weird to use. When you upgrade it, this becomes 5 arrows, so it gets better in terms of like its hit detection. But generally, you need to like play around with it to get the exact range, figure out how far away it is before it splits, because theoretically it could be very good against packs of enemies if you can get that sorted out. That's going to take some trial and error on your part in testing, so it's not a really new player-friendly ability, and I wouldn't recommend using it unless you intend to like really dedicate yourself to the bow and figure out how to optimize using it. The capstone in this tree, Concussion, is much better than the other one. It gives you increased damage if you headshot, which you should be aiming for most of the time. And it also gives you a chance to get your arrow back, helping you conserve arrows. It's not really hard to make arrows, but getting that extra damage is going to go a long way to helping kill enemies faster. In terms of weapons that you want to pair the bow with, bow functions very well at mid to short range, so you can get away with not using a melee weapon probably a lot easier than using something like a musket, because once enemies are point blank range with a musket, it can be really hard to be effective. But with a bow, you have ways of creating separation. You don't need to reload a bow the way you need to reload a musket, so even after like a short cooldown after your shot, you're going to be able to keep firing as long as you can keep separation without having to worry about that. So if you want to play a pure ranged build, you can just use a bow. However, your cooldowns are going to be shared, so you can't put like 2 bows on. You're going to want a second weapon. Maybe you want a musket for longer range encounters, and then you swap to your bow when they're close. Or you can use like a spear or a rapier if you want a melee weapon when enemies close the gap. You can switch to your melee weapon and be effective. Both spear and rapier are very, very good dex weapons, so I'd recommend either one of those pairing with the bow as well. Because this weapon has no int scaling, unlike the musket, you're not going to pair it with something like a fire staff or an ice gauntlet, which you could pair with a musket, because you could just pump intelligence and then those still deal more damage, and your musket may not be as effective as if you went pure dexterity. But they would be able to be pairings. Even if you split your points between dexterity and intelligence, you'd still be able to use those weapons much more effectively. But because you're going to go full dex if you're using a bow, ideally, there's no point in using those weapons with a bow. And lastly, all arrows are not the same. So as you get through the game and your level increases, you're going to be able to use higher and higher level arrows, which are going to increase your damage multiplier. So you always want to make sure as you hit the next threshold, like I think it's like 20, 40, 60, something like that, you're going to want to make sure that you upgrade and start using the highest level arrows that you can use. Your damage is always as high as it can be. And you either want to craft those if you're a crafter, or buy them off the auction hall, or have someone make them for your trade or whatever. But make sure your arrows are always the best ones you can use. One thing I do want to mention too is the armor you should be wearing while using a ranged weapon like a bow or musket or maybe a staff is light armor. The reason for this is you gain plus 20% damage. If you're talking about hitting something from far away before it gets to you, you want all the damage you can get. You're not banking on getting hit. So going all in on that light armor to get increased damage is going to make every shot of yours count, and you're definitely going to want that. Stay tuned for more New World weapon guides, and if you have further questions about the bow, you can always drop by Twitch and ask me, or you can check out the New World wiki for all the information about the game. What do you guys think about the bow? Have you used it at all? What kind of weapons do you use? Do you like the bow, or do you prefer the musket? Let us know in the comments below.